The Five was in full swing that Thursday afternoon, the panel working through their standard rotation of topics with the practiced rhythm of a show that had been on air for over a decade. Jesse Waters was mid-monologue about what he called the weaponization of the Justice Department, his tone carrying that signature mix of incredulity and amusement that played well with the show's core audience. Greg Gutfeld had just delivered a joke comparing the January 6th committee to a Soviet show trial that got enthusiastic laughter from the studio audience. Judge Jeanine Pirro was nodding along, clearly preparing to jump in with her own prosecutorial perspective on government overreach. Dana Perino sat slightly apart from the energy, her expression suggesting she was calculating how to bring the conversation back towards something resembling policy substance. And then, during what was supposed to be a commercial break, a Fox News producer appeared on set with an expression that immediately changed the energy in the room. There had been a last-minute booking change. A Democratic congresswoman had been invited to join the panel for the next segment to provide what the network was calling balance after complaints about the show's January 6th coverage. The panel would now be 6 instead of 5. The congresswoman was already in the building. She would be joining them in 90 seconds. The producer didn't name her, but the look on his face suggested this wasn't going to be a friendly addition. When Jasmine Crockett walked onto the set carrying a burgundy leather folder and wearing an expression of professional courtesy that somehow felt more dangerous than hostility, Jesse Waters actually laughed out loud. "Oh, this is going to be fun." The show returned from commercial with Dana Perino doing the introduction, her voice carrying the forced enthusiasm of someone trying to maintain journalistic credibility while knowing exactly what was about to happen. Welcome back to The Five. We have a special guest joining us for this segment. Representative Jasmine Crockett from Texas is here to discuss the ongoing debate over the January 6th investigation and what Democrats are calling accountability versus what many Republicans view as political persecution. Representative, welcome to the show. Crockett thanked her with the kind of calm politeness that made everyone on the panel immediately wary. Before she could say anything else, Waters jumped in. Representative Crockett, great to have you. I have to say, I'm surprised you agreed to come into the lion's den here. We don't usually get Democrats willing to defend the January 6th witch hunt on this show. So I'm curious, are you here to actually have a conversation, or are you here to repeat the same talking points we've heard 1,000 times about insurrection and democracy? His smile was wide and completely insincere. Gutfeld added, "Yeah, and fair warning, we've got Judge Jeanine here, an actual prosecutor who understands how the law works. So maybe come prepared with something better than democracy was on the ballot." The studio audience laughed. Crockett waited for the laughter to die down before responding. When she spoke, her tone was measured and almost gentle. "I appreciate the warm welcome. And yes, I'm here to have a conversation. I brought some materials I thought might be helpful for that conversation." She placed the burgundy folder on the table in front of her. "But before we get into January 6th specifically, I want to address something Mr. Waters just said. You called it a witch hunt. That's interesting language. So let me ask you directly, how many people have been convicted in connection with January 6th? Waters leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying himself. "Oh, hundreds." "Sure. But how many of them were actually charged with insurrection? How many were charged with trying to overthrow the government?" "Most of them got slapped with trespassing charges because that's all it was, protesters who got out of hand." Crockett nodded slowly as though considering this. "So you acknowledge that hundreds of people have been convicted." "That's good. Let's talk about what they were convicted of." She opened her folder to a page marked with a yellow tab. "This is data from the Department of Justice tracking all January 6th prosecutions as of last month. Total defendants charged 1,106. Total convicted either by guilty plea or jury verdict, 718. Of those 718 convictions, how many do you think were just trespassing?" Waters shrugged. "Most of them." Crockett pulled out a highlighted document. 11. 11 people were convicted solely of trespassing-related offenses. The other 707 were convicted of assault on law enforcement, destruction of government property, conspiracy, obstruction of an official proceeding, and weapons charges. 140 officers were injured. 15 were hospitalized. 4 died by suicide in the months following the attack. Those aren't my numbers. Those are the FBI's numbers. So when you call it protesters who got out of hand, what you're actually describing is the largest single-day assault on law enforcement in American history. The set went very quiet. Perino tried to jump in. "I think the concern many Americans have is about proportionality. Yes, there was violence, but the way it's been covered versus the coverage of the 2020 riots," Crockett interrupted, something she had clearly decided to do when necessary. Let's talk about proportionality then. She turned to another tab in her folder. This is sentencing data for all 718 convictions. The average sentence for a January 6th defendant convicted of assault on law enforcement was 41 months. The average sentence for property destruction was 18 months. The average sentence for obstruction was 27 months. Now let's compare that to the 2020 protests you mentioned. The average sentence for similar charges during the George Floyd protests was 14 months for assault on law enforcement and 8 months for property destruction. So if anything, January 6th defendants are receiving lighter sentences than the 2020 protesters, not harsher ones. Where's the disproportionate treatment you're describing? Judge Janine's face had flushed. Representative, I've been a prosecutor and a judge for decades. What you're not mentioning is that the January 6th defendants are being held in pretrial detention in conditions that amount to political imprisonment. They're being denied bail. Crockett didn't let her finish. Judge Pirro, let's talk about pretrial detention. She pulled out another document. This is federal pretrial detention data from the D.C. District Court. Of the 1,106 January 6 defendants, 163 were held in pretrial detention. That's 14%. The national average for pretrial detention in federal cases involving assault on law enforcement is 19%. So January 6 defendants are actually being detained at lower rates than the national average for similar charges. Again, where's the political persecution? Gutfeld jumped in, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Okay, so you've got statistics. Great, but let's talk about what this is really about. The January 6th committee was a show trial designed to hurt Trump politically before the midterms. No Republican representation, no due process, just a bunch of Democrats using government power to destroy their political opponents. You can't deny that. Crockett turned to face him directly. Let's address that. You said no Republican representation. That's false. Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger are both Republicans. Both served on the committee. Gutfeld waved his hand dismissively. They're not real Republicans. They're never Trumpers, who Crockett's voice cut through. They were elected as Republicans. They voted with the Republican conference on most legislation. They're not fake Republicans just because they didn't support Trump. But let's talk about representation more broadly. Do you know why there weren't more Republicans on the committee? She didn't wait for an answer. Speaker Pelosi offered Minority Leader McCarthy the opportunity to appoint 5 members to the committee. McCarthy selected 5 representatives, including Jim Jordan and Jim Banks. Pelosi rejected Jordan and Banks because both were potential material witnesses to the events being investigated. They had direct communications with the White House on January 6th. She accepted the other 3 Republicans McCarthy proposed. McCarthy then withdrew all 5 and refused to participate. So the lack of what you call Republican representation wasn't because Democrats blocked it. It was because McCarthy chose not to participate when he couldn't install people who were potential witnesses into the investigation. That's not persecution. That's basic investigative ethics. The panel was starting to look rattled. Waters tried a different angle, his voice taking on an edge. Okay, but you can't deny that the committee destroyed evidence. They deleted witness testimony. They hid transcripts that didn't support their narrative. That came out after the fact. Crockett's expression didn't change. Where did that come out? Please cite your source. Waters hesitated. It was reported. Conservative outlets confirmed that. Crockett interrupted. Conservative outlets reported claims made by Republican congressmen without evidence. The House Administration Committee, now controlled by Republicans, investigated those claims and found 0 evidence of destroyed testimony or deleted records. The full transcript of every deposition and every hearing was provided to the National Archives as required by law. This is public record, so when you say that came out after the fact, when what you mean is Republicans made an accusation that was investigated and found to be baseless. Those are very different things. She pulled out another document. In fact, let's talk about what actually came out after the fact. This is testimony from Cassidy Hutchinson, a White House aide, describing Donald Trump's actions on January 6th. She testified under oath that Trump knew the crowd was armed, demanded that metal detectors be removed so the crowd would look bigger, and physically lunged at his Secret Service detail when they refused to take him to the Capitol. Her testimony was corroborated by multiple Secret Service agents and White House staff. That came out during the investigation. Is that the kind of evidence you're saying the committee was hiding? Judge Janine's voice rose. That testimony was disputed. Secret Service agents said it didn't happen. Crockett remained calm. One Secret Service agent initially told colleagues he would dispute it. When called to testify under oath before the committee, he invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and declined to testify. That's not disputing testimony. That's refusing to testify at all. 2 other agents corroborated Hutchinson's account, so the weight of evidence under oath supports her version, not the version that was leaked to the press and never actually testified to. The panel was visibly struggling now. Perino, clearly trying to regain some ground, shifted topics. Representative, I think where a lot of Americans get concerned is the language around January 6th. Calling it an insurrection, calling it an attempt to overthrow the government, that feels like hyperbole when you look at what actually happened. Crockett turned to face her. Let's define terms then. What would you call an attempt to prevent the certification of a presidential election through violence and intimidation? Perino hesitated. I would call it a riot that got out of control. Crockett nodded. A riot. Okay, let's examine that. She turned to yet another tab in her folder. This is the Oath Keepers' seditious conspiracy trial verdict. Stuart Rhodes and 4 other Oath Keepers members were convicted of seditious conspiracy, plotting to use force to prevent the execution of the law. Specifically, they were convicted of planning to use violence to stop the certification of the election. That's not a riot. That's a planned conspiracy. The jury heard evidence of encrypted communications, weapon stockpiles, and coordinated movements. They deliberated and unanimously found seditious conspiracy. That's not hyperbole. That's a jury conviction. Waters was getting visibly angry now, his voice sharp. You keep throwing around jury verdicts like they mean something. We all know these trials were in D.C., the most liberal jurisdiction in the country. These defendants never had a chance at a fair trial with D.C. juries. Crockett's response was immediate and devastating. Mr. Waters, are you saying that jury verdicts don't count if they happen in jurisdictions you consider too liberal? Because that's an extraordinary claim. These were federal trials with federal judges, most of them appointed by Republican presidents. The defendants had lawyers. They presented evidence. They cross-examined witnesses. The jury heard both sides and reached a verdict. If you're saying that doesn't count because it happened in D.C., you're not critiquing the January 6th investigation. You're rejecting the entire concept of rule of law in urban areas. The silence that followed was electric. Waters opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. I'm saying there's legitimate concern about jury bias. Crockett leaned forward slightly. Then why didn't the defendants request a change of venue? Federal defendants have that right. Not one January 6th defendant successfully argued for a venue change because the evidence of pretrial publicity and bias wasn't there. You're inventing a problem that defense attorneys didn't even argue existed. She wasn't done. But let's talk about legitimate concerns. I have a legitimate concern. 4 police officers who defended the Capitol on January 6th have died by suicide. Officer Howard Liebengood, 9 days after the attack. Officer Jeffrey Smith, 12 days after. Officer Gunther Hashida, 7 months after. Officer Kyle DeFreetag, 7 months after. All 4 had testified or provided statements about the violence they experienced that day. All 4 described ongoing trauma. Those are facts. So my question to this panel is, if January 6th was just a protest that got out of hand, why are officers who survived it killing themselves? The studio had gone completely silent. Judge Janine's face was rigid. Gutfeld was staring at the desk. Waters looked like he was trying to formulate a response and couldn't find one. Perino, to her credit, spoke quietly. That's a tragedy. No one disputes that. Crockett's voice was soft but unyielding. It's not just a tragedy. It's a consequence. A consequence of violence that this panel has spent the last 40 minutes trying to minimize, dismiss, and reframe as political persecution. Those officers are dead. 140 officers were injured. 718 people have been convicted of crimes. The Vice President of the United States was evacuated because a mob was chanting about hanging him. Those are not talking points. Those are human consequences of what happened. And when you call it a witch hunt, when you call the investigation a show trial, when you dismiss the evidence and the verdicts and the testimony, you're telling those officers and their families that their trauma doesn't matter. You're telling the American people that violence is acceptable if it's committed by people you agree with politically. She pulled out one more document. This is the oath that every member of Congress takes. I swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. On January 6, 2021, there was a domestic enemy of the Constitution. It was a mob trying to prevent the peaceful transfer of power. Some of us honored our oath by investigating what happened and holding people accountable. Others have spent 2 years making excuses for it. I know which side of that oath I'm on. I'm asking this panel, which side are you on? The silence that followed was total and absolute. No one spoke. No one moved. The studio audience, which had been enthusiastically applauding conservative talking points minutes earlier, was completely quiet. And then something unprecedented happened. The camera cut to commercial, not at a natural break point. Not after a segment conclusion. Just a sudden, jarring cut to a Provagen ad while Crockett was still sitting at the table, her folder open, her expression calm, and the entire panel looking like they had just been hit by a truck. When the show came back from commercial 2 minutes later, Jasmine Crockett was gone. The panel was back to 5. Jesse Waters was already mid-sentence about inflation and Biden's economic policies, as though the previous segment had never happened. There was no explanation for where Crockett went, no mention of her name, no reference to anything she had said. The show simply continued as though she had never been there at all. But social media had already exploded. Viewers had recorded the segment on their phones. The clip of Crockett asking which side of the oath the panel was on, followed by complete silence, followed by the abrupt cut to commercial, was viral within minutes. Within an hour, They Shut the Feed was trending nationally. Within 2 hours, media critics were writing about Fox News literally cutting a guest off air rather than respond to her evidence. Within 6 hours, Jasmine Crockett would release a statement saying she had not been asked to leave, had not been escorted from the building, but had simply been told during the commercial break that her segment was over and they were moving on to other topics. The recording would be analyzed endlessly. First Amendment advocates would debate whether a network could invite a guest and then remove them from air mid-segment. Political commentators would dissect every moment of the exchange. But what everyone kept returning to was the simplest thing. Jasmine Crockett had walked onto Fox News with a folder full of Department of Justice data, federal court verdicts, sentencing statistics, and officer testimony. She had been called into the lion's den. She had been mocked before she asked her first question. And then she had systematically dismantled every single talking point the panel offered. Witch hunt? 718 convictions. Political persecution? Lighter sentences than comparable cases. Show trial? Republicans chose not to participate. Biased juries? Defense attorneys never requested venue changes. Hyperbole? Seditious conspiracy convictions. And when confronted with the suicides of 4 officers, when asked which side of their constitutional oath they were on, the panel had no answer. So Fox News did the only thing they could do. They cut to commercial and pretended the segment never happened. They removed her from the set. They continued the show as though the previous 15 minutes had been erased from reality. But the internet doesn't forget. The recordings existed. The silence existed. The empty chair where Crockett had been sitting existed. And the question she had asked, which side of the oath are you on, hung in the air unanswered. In the green room afterward, before she left the building, a young Fox News production assistant approached Crockett nervously. They're saying you ambushed them, that you brought prepared attacks instead of having a real conversation. Crockett looked at the folder she was packing into her bag. I brought Justice Department statistics, court records, and jury verdicts. I asked them to respond to evidence. If that feels like an ambush, it's because they've been having conversations without evidence for so long that being asked to defend their claims with facts feels unfair. She headed for the exit, walking past green rooms where she could hear raised voices, producers and executives clearly in crisis mode about how to handle the aftermath. She ignored them. Outside the building, reporters were already gathering, having heard that something extraordinary had happened during the taping. They shouted questions as she walked to her car. Representative Crockett, Fox is saying you violated the agreed-upon topics. Do you have a response? She stopped, turned to face the cameras. I was invited to discuss January 6th and the investigation. That's what I discussed. I brought evidence. I asked questions. If Fox News didn't like the answers their own panel couldn't provide, that's not my problem. That's theirs. Someone shouted, they cut you off mid-segment. They've never done that before. Crockett's expression was unreadable. They cut the feed because the alternative was worse. The alternative was their panel sitting in silence, unable to respond to basic evidence, unable to defend their characterization of January 6th as a witch hunt when confronted with officer suicides and seditious conspiracy convictions. Cutting to commercial was the smartest thing they could have done because staying with that segment would have required them to either admit they were wrong or continue to minimize the deaths of police officers on national television. They chose the commercial. She got in her car and drove away, leaving the reporters to file their stories about the Fox News segment that ended in unprecedented silence, followed by an unprecedented mid-segment commercial break, followed by the guest simply disappearing from the show with no explanation. The network would spend the next week in damage control mode, with various hosts claiming Crockett had been scheduled only for a brief segment, that her time had simply run out naturally, that the commercial break was always planned for that moment, but the timeline didn't support any of those explanations. The segment had been 3 minutes long when it was cut. Standard 5 segments run 7 to 9 minutes. The commercial break was not marked in the production rundown. And most damningly, Crockett herself confirmed she had been told she would have a full segment to discuss January 6th, not a brief appearance. Fox News had invited her on. They had mocked her. They had assumed she would be easy to dismiss. And when she brought receipts instead of talking points, when she systematically demolished their narrative with Justice Department data and federal court records, when she asked them which side of their constitutional oath they were on and they had no answer, the network made a choice. They could let the silence continue and broadcast their panel's complete inability to respond. Or they could cut the feed and pretend it never happened. They chose to cut the feed. And in doing so, they answered Jasmine Crockett's question more clearly than any words could have. They weren't on the side of the oath. They were on the side of the narrative. And when forced to choose between the two, they chose to protect the narrative at all costs. Even if it meant doing something they had never done before. Even if it meant the entire country would see them do it. Even if it meant proving Crockett's point more effectively than she ever could have herself. Jasmine Crockett had walked onto Fox News. She had destroyed their entire panel with nothing but documented evidence, and they had cut the feed rather than face it. The empty chair, the awkward commercial break, the segment that disappeared, all of it said more than any answer could have. And everyone watching knew exactly what it meant.